Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And Dan, thanks to you to have me on the Leadership Symposium, and really do appreciate everything that Theory into Practice is doing and really support that mission. I really like the fact that you put on a TED Talk about how a public speaker is supposed to speak right before I go on. So thanks for that.
It's all for you, my friend.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Randal Collins, and as he said, I'm in Saudi Arabia. I am currently the Emergency Management Senior Director for the city of Neom. Neom is the largest mega project that Saudi Arabia is doing to build a cognitive, sustainable, green city. And it's a $500 billion project that they're really putting a lot of effort into to really change the culture in Saudi Arabia and offer new opportunities to Saudi Arabia other than oil. And so they're really building a lot of these mega projects all over Saudi Arabia. As I said, this one's the flagship, but they're really trying to make some changes here with respect to tourism and other ways to make revenue rather than oil. So they're trying to get off the oil. That said, I'm also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Southern California, where I teach the online master's program for that school, my alma mater, where I also got my doctorate degree in organizational change and leadership. And so super excited to be with you today. And throughout my career, I've been an emergency manager at the state and the local levels, both municipal, county, and again, state, and from Indiana, and then eventually moved to California before moving here to Saudi Arabia. So that's a little bit about my background. And as we get into this is a presentation of a peer-reviewed journal article that I did that proposes replacing recovery and the 4 phases of emergency management with adaptation. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. And what I really believe about adaptation is that it not only can help us evolve in emergency management, but the more adaptive intelligence that an emergency manager has, both personally and implemented into their programs of emergency management, will make them a much better emergency manager, because they're ready for that change, and they're ready to evolve to the next thing, and they're ready for their organizations, they're ready for their communities, and they're ready for themselves to thrive based on the change that is incurred. So with that, before I start, I would really like to first just ask you all, do you care if your beliefs are true? And my assumption is that most of you are going to be like, yeah, I really care that my beliefs are true. And so then I follow that up with, what if one of your beliefs weren't true? Would you care? And my assumption again would be that you all would say, yes, if I have a misbelief, if I'm misinformed, I would want to correct that, which then just leads you to the next logical question, which is, how likely is it that all of your beliefs are true? And then when you evaluate that, you're thinking, oh my, maybe everything I think I know, I don't know. And so I should be really willing to challenge my own beliefs so I can make sure that they're true, or do some research, get some better experience, whatever the case may be, to get you to a better understanding and a truer belief. So that's my focus. I usually start off with this, the allegory of the cave by Plato, but don't really have time for that today. But I really do want to ask you to think in dimensions. And I believe that emergency managers are very good at this. I'll explain that in a minute. But if your approach to our problems, if your approach to emergency management comes in, it allows you to revolve around and check things out from different angles, then you're going to be a better emergency manager that way. Because as we all know, we have to look at it from our own lens that is putting this big puzzle together, but we also need to be sensitive to our other stakeholders who are involved in emergencies with us, because we become advocates for them, and we become advocates helping one stakeholder to another understand the complexities of each other's perspective so that they can mutually support one another. So we as emergency managers can improve incorporating the concepts of adaptation for ourselves and for our program. And then what we want to do with emergency management is transform emergency management. We need to spend a little bit more time, instead of working in emergency management, working on emergency management, so that emergency management can improve, and we can improve the way that we protect our communities. And then our communities is obviously the reason we're here as emergency managers. And what we really want to do after a disaster is flourish and thrive. And sometimes recovery takes us backwards because we're accepting the fact that, we lost, something was damaged or whatever, and now we want to go back to the way things were. And that may not be always the best way to do things. That may not be the best way to achieve what you're trying to achieve within your community. So this is why I think emergency managers are multidimensional and why they're great thought leaders, because they are able to see the various sides of a different problem, of a disaster, of an emergency, of the politics of emergency management, and use that to their advantage. I show you three pictures here and three shapes here or whatever, and most people would say it's a square, it's a triangle, it's a square with an X in it. But an emergency manager should be able to see that they're all the same thing. So the square becomes the base of a pyramid that you see at the bottom, and then the triangle obviously is just one side of many sides, and then the square with the box in it is you looking from the top down on a pyramid. And so we see all those different perspectives, and that's what great emergency managers do. They're able to see those different perspectives and try to help prepare all the stakeholders for those different perspectives, and especially during a response, try to coordinate the resources to meet the needs of all the different perspectives. What we're really focused on in adaptation for emergency management is an evolution of a discipline. And one of the things that you have to really be focused on is not to be an expert. An expert knows everything. And so I hate when people call me a subject matter expert or whatever the case may be. I'd rather be referred to more of an explorer. And I've learned a lot and I want to learn more. But sometimes to learn, you have to be willing to unlearn. And so we have to let go of the habits and hard-held beliefs that we were taught, because those beliefs have taken us down a particular road that, quite frankly, it inhibits you from exploring the other roads in your area. And we continue to go down roads and feel like we can't turn back, or we can't unlearn or get on another road to understand a different perspective or to understand what might get us further in emergency management. So we have to be curious and challenge the things that come our way. We have to be able to really recognize that not everything that is being given to us is enmeshed in research and data. And so what we want to do is challenge that norm and say, can we do it better? Is there a better way to do things, instead of just continuing to do the same thing the same way over and over again within our emergency management program? And what we see is a lot of times we get just stagnated by the dogma that we have, all this emergency management doctrine that we have we have HCEP, and we have NIMS, and we have all the different planning documents for the National Response Framework and the National Recovery Framework and so forth. And so all of that unchallenged, all of that without examination becomes that dogma that I'm talking about. And more importantly, in the middle of this slide, that number 2 definition, a doctrine or code of beliefs accepted as authoritative, and the first one, a religious doctrine that is proclaimed as true without proof. And sometimes I think we as emergency managers, we go to training and we get some training, we get presented some information, and we accept it as truth because they're the instructors and we're the students. And that may not always be the case, because some of this doctrine is really old and hasn't emerged and evolved the way it probably should have. One thing that we have to do is be willing to unlearn, as I mentioned before. So we have to be able to imagine, and we have to be able to focus on things and focus on doing things differently. So a lot of you see the bottom right corner, a lot of you may have switched between a Mac operating system and a Windows operating system. And many of you know that from doing that the mouse is completely different. You roll one way on one and you roll the other way on the other to get the screen to go the way that you want. And it becomes very frustrating, because if you came from an Apple environment or a Mac environment and moved over, you have to unlearn that, okay, I've got to go a different way. But we become so programmed to do that. That's the perfect example of how we have to unlearn so we can relearn a new system, a new evolution in emergency management. And so that's a little bit of our focus. And we also would show that we are constrained by what we have learned. Sometimes that learning, it propels us a little bit, but then they become handcuffs to us because it prevents us from learning more in a particular area, because it prevents us from being a little bit more creative and throwing in new ideas and assimilating them or synthesizing them together to come up with a more innovative or creative idea. So one thing that you have to do is you have to ask yourself, if I were to design an emergency management framework, what would that look like? And that was one thing that I really have enjoyed about being here in NEOM. When I got here, I was the first emergency manager here and really had the opportunity to start developing a program of emergency management that it has been unimpeded by anybody else. I've not taken the handoff from anybody. There was no program before. So completely white slate in developing the emergency management program here, and allows me somewhat, because I'm not, obviously, I still, even as the director, I still don't have authority to just do whatever I want. I'm still constrained by money. I still have bosses that want things their way and so forth. So it's not completely unimpeded, but I do have the opportunity to build a program from scratch, which is really exciting for me as I get to do new things and creative things along not only with the ideas, but even with the technology that we're using here in the development of this cognitive city and so forth. And so many of you we've become a little bit more familiar with mutation after COVID. And if you rewind a little bit and go back to 2021 or whatever, it was this strain and then it was that strain. And these strains became stronger, more communicable, more whatever. But there were also strains that happened that just died out. They were the weaker strains. And so they don't survive. And that's what adaptation really does, is it creates multiple variations, and then the weak variations die off and the stronger variations just get stronger and stronger. And so that is basically trying to take that scientific approach, that biological approach that happens in these viruses, and apply that to emergency management. We want to create new variants and let the old variants die out, or the weaker variants die out, and the newer variants and the stronger variants become more and more applicable to what we're doing, and that we can implement that for the strength of emergency management, for the strength of our communities. So I want to talk about some definitions, and I really hate doing definitions in public speaking, but to really understand the differences and the points that I'm trying to make, we really have to have an understanding of what adaptation is. And so when we talk about adaptation, we talk about a slow, usually unconscious modification of individuals in social activity and adjustment. Holy crap. Bear with me, guys. My computer is, everybody still on the screen? Okay. Activity and adjustment to the cultural surroundings. So we're adjusting to the things that are around us. And again, these definitions, there are multiple definitions that you can look up, some scientific, some more layman's terms, but all of them have a little bit of the same things in them. So in this one, a form or structure modified to fit a changed environment. So something's changing and we obviously adapt to it. And then the last one, any alteration in the structure or function of it. This is more of that biological one. Any alteration in the structure or function of an organization or any of its parts that results from natural selection, and by which the organism becomes better fitted to survive and multiply in its environment. So key thing there in the end there, better fitted to survive and multiply in its environment. And that's what I want us to do in emergency management. I want emergency management to evolve so it's better fitted to survive and multiply in its environment. I think most of us will probably agree we'd like to see emergency management grow a little bit. Many of you probably have this belief that emergency management offices are small, underfunded compared to many of our brothers, sisters, cousin organizations and so forth. And so what we really need to do is change the mindset of people and adapt emergency management so that we are a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit more flexible, a little bit better to deal with whatever hazards come our way. And the hazards change. We have emerging threats all the time. Definitely when I started in emergency management, I never thought that emergency managers would be dealing with an Afghan relocation issue here in the United States. And that's just one of hundreds of examples that we could talk about in terms of the different emerging threats that we have. Okay, there we go. We talk about adaptation leads to transformation, which leads to the evolution. And then what the ultimate goal is: thriving, flourishment, adaptive fitness, and plasticity. And that allows us to shift, change, and adjust as much as we need to deal with the situations that are arising, especially after a disaster when things are crazy and things are damaged and ruined. Then that really gets us to think about, well, do we really need to put what was there before there again, or can we do something completely different? And is there something more that the community needs there? Is there something more that the person or persons or business that was ruined might do something different that makes them a little bit more able to thrive and flourish in the new environment that we have from the disaster? When we talk about evolution, we have some definitions as well. Any process or formation or growth, change by such process as mutation, natural selection, or genetic drift. So remember back to that slide I had with the mutation. It's changed by the process of natural selection and that genetic drift. And then a lot of people like to, quote as the survival of the fittest, which actually was Herbert Spencer who interpreted Darwin's research on that. But really, Darwin's theory was more appropriately survival of the most adaptable. So the stronger thing here is not the fittest, because oftentimes the fittest will also survive because they don't adapt to the newest threat that they're dealing with. And so they'll die off. But the adaptable really deal with that. They don't have to be so strong or anything. They just have to adapt and change so that they can tolerate the new environment that they're in. So fundamentally, understanding recovery is an important part of why I need to communicate that, so that we can understand why I want to get rid of recovery and bring in adaptation in its place. And so when I first became an emergency manager way back in a long time ago, I was basically taught recovery is we want to get back to the way things were before an incident occurs. And then a few years passed by and we learned a little bit about that, and we changed that a little bit. And we said, okay, it's either get back to normal or get back to what the new normal was, some of the buzzwords at the time. And we still hear that from time to time as well. And with a new normal means we're not going back to the way things were. And therefore, recovery is not a great word for that in the English language, because re means back. We're going backward. We're repeating. We're trying to return to a previous state. And the essence is that we need to fight, deny, or erase the incident that has occurred. And that's just not good for us in terms of dealing with the trauma of disaster, whether that's the personal trauma that an individual has after a disaster, or whether that's the shock and awe to the system, shock and awe to your jurisdiction, to the infrastructure, and so forth. But either way, if we're trying to go back, that's inhibiting us from accepting what has happened and then moving forward to thrive and flourish with maybe a new method or a new strategy or a new piece of equipment, whatever it is that we need to focus on to thrive and flourish, rather than just myopically thinking, we got to get back to the way it was. We got to get back to the way it was. That is not helping us as a profession in emergency management. If anybody knows where we originally got the 4 phases of emergency management to include recovery, let me know now. Anybody? Hands up. So yeah, nobody does. And that's why I think it's dogma. It's been forced upon us because that's what we're all trained to do. We should have 4 phases of emergency management, and recovery is part of those 4 phases, but nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows how it was implemented, why it was implemented, or anything else. The answer is it comes from a National Governors Association document, and now I'm going to forget it, 78 or 79, the late 70s, and nobody really even knows who wrote that document. So right now we have absolute dogma. We have no proof as to why we are doing these 4 phases of emergency management, yet that's all we do. We're so tied to them, and nobody has a discussion about changing those 4 phases up. And that's why I'm trying to challenge the status quo and do that. But this is the paragraph that was in that National Governors Association document that says what recovery is. And granted, I am going to give to you that in here, it talks about recovery activities continue until all systems return to normal or better. So they do give some props to making things better, but it still is just a mindset of going backward, a mindset of returning to normal, as it says, or better. But that kind of tells me, hey, we're going back to normal, but maybe slightly improved. Instead of, you know what, maybe we don't need to do this at all. Maybe we need to do something completely different, and our business will be better that way. Our business will thrive that way. And so that's why we should be focusing more on adaptation at this point than recovery, because adaptation says something has happened and we're just adjusting to that new environment. And like I was saying, when we have that disaster, we have trauma. And the mere acknowledgement of an incident means we can't go back. If anybody's ever experienced a disaster, and not as an emergency manager, although that counts too, but my point is better understood from a citizen, a resident, whatever, that has experienced disaster, that's not prepared from the mindset that an emergency manager is for disaster. But the mere acknowledgement of an incident means that we can't go back, because that person has now experienced a tornado or a flood. They've experienced their home being wiped out. They've experienced the death of a child or the death of a loved one, whatever the case may be. And so that trauma will never be able to be erased. And so our focus needs to be a little bit more about accepting that trauma rather than just going backward or trying to say, if we could only go backward. So some sort of trauma has occurred, and that means that something has changed. And as emergency managers, we should be looking backward, or we should not be looking backward, and we should be really focusing on healing. And that healing leads to acceptance, or comes from that acceptance, and then allows us to forward progress. In fact, this is a very psychologically sound concept, because anybody that's either taken some counseling for PTSD or other sorts of trauma that you might have, obviously we're trying to make sense of what that trauma is. And once we make sense of that trauma, that's what a psychologist is trying to get you to really do, is make sense of that trauma, so that then once you make sense of it, you can move forward in your life. And this is the same concept applied to a much broader, obviously, emergency management concept. So adaptation means acknowledging the trauma and processing it, and then it infers acknowledging changing and changing with the change. And I really, as I started developing the research into this, I was like, how do I really define this? And then I don't know when it happened, but changing with the change really stood out to me, because the world's going to change on us, and we have to change with that if we're going to survive, if we're going to be the adaptable one that makes us the fittest and ready. So it's being a palm tree rather than the oak tree. And this is a perfect example of an oak tree, by far stronger, healthier, whatever you want to call it, and just really rock solid during a windstorm sometimes, until the windstorm exceeds the abilities of that oak tree to stand strong, and then it breaks or falls over or whatever. But the palm trees, they bend. And that is their strength as a palm tree. They can take those 75-mile hurricane force winds and bend in such a way that once the wind's done, then they bounce back up. They're just changing with the change. And that's what we should be doing in emergency management. Prominent psychologist, B.F. Skinner, he was very focused on basically indicating that we're all animals. The humans are animals. Animals, of course, are animals. And so we all act in an animalistic way, if you go back to our caveman roots and so forth. And so that's kind of what we're fueled by, or that's what our roots are. And then, but what we find is that we are shaped by our environment. So we've been shaped as emergency managers. We've been told, here are the 4 phases of emergency management. We've been told many other things in emergency management that we just blindly accept, and we've been shaped by our environment. But the true strength should be in the ability to adjust or create new environments. And that's what we're trying to do after a disaster, is create a new environment to our advantage. Instead of taking the environment that the hurricane or flood has left us, we should be creating a new environment as emergency managers within our community. It's also aligned with the concept of a fixed versus growth mindset. And that growth mindset equals potential. Somebody with a growth mindset is going to be focused totally on how can we grow? How can we learn from this? How can we improve our program? How can we improve ourselves and so forth during and after a disaster, versus a fixed mindset is about achieving. And so we're focused on some sort of KPI or target. And once we've done it, we're done. We stop and we move on to the next thing. But a growth mindset is always looking at improving and evolving. And so that's where I think that growth mindset is better used in emergency management, while as the fixed mindset in emergency management just keeps us right where we are. It doesn't allow us to focus on, we may be successful in all the things that we're doing, and we may be successful in the benchmarks or the KPIs that we're trying to meet. And it looks on paper like a very solid emergency management program, but it's very rigid. And when it gets hit with chaos and it gets hit with confusion and it gets hit with politics and everything else that goes into it, that can be our downfall. Whereas the growth mindset allows us to rise above it and think about new things for emergency management. So recovery implies a specific mindset, that growth mindset, and that adaptation mindset that makes you think, okay, we've got to overcome, we've got to improvise, we've got to adapt. Can you tell I'm a Marine? So yeah, using those things that I learned so early in my career is that focus that we need in emergency management. So if we imagine a mindset that changes the way that we think, changes the way that we accept information and apply information, that's adaptation. And it acknowledges the threat and the reality that occurs. So we can be comfortable in the fact that, yeah, we're dealing with the various things that we deal with in emerging threats in emergency management, or it doesn't even have to be an emerging threat as much as it can be something that's, hey, typically our floods come to 3 feet in this particular area of the town or the city or whatever. But lo and behold, here in the past 3 years, we've hit records time and time again, and now it's 9 feet there. That's a huge change to that flood zone based on the amount of precipitation that we're getting or however the rivers are flowing and so forth. And so that allows us to acknowledge those threats, those changing threats, and adjust to them. Adaptation not only accounts for what has happened, but considers what will happen. So adaptation is forward-looking in terms of what's going to happen. So when we're making changes, repairs, whatever you want to call it, after a disaster, we're going to see all kinds of new ideas using an adaptation mindset versus the non-adaptation mindset. And I just threw out some examples here, and many of these would be big ideas needing some big engineers and a whole lot of support from the community and everything else. I get it. But just as an exercise in strategic thinking, as an exercise in creative, new thinking, adaptation thinking, one thing that you could think about is the levees in New Orleans, or can we turn that into a Venice, Italy? It's already underwater, below sea level, and so forth. It's flooded time and time again. Why do we keep rebuilding in those particular areas? Can we do something different and be more flourishing and thriving by creating more of a touristy place where people want to go, and just like Venice is? And so let's just flood those streets. Obviously, we have to have a construction plan and everything in place, but let's stop trying to combat the forces of nature that keep coming back to flood it. Instead, let's embrace the fact that it will flood here. So what can we do with the water in the area that we're talking about updating? Another thing is like a water pipeline system. We have parts of the United States that are in drought mode all the time, and we have parts of our state in the United States that have floods all the time. So we don't have a water shortage problem. We have a water transmission problem. Can we take that water from one end of the country to the other end of the country if necessary? And we do this all the time with other hazardous material pipelines and so forth. So why can't we do that with water and get the water to where it needs to go to help us flourish a little bit more? There's others, magnetic hovering homes during floods, or a floating home during floods. Some of those things are things that we could incorporate into our mitigation plan or whatever, and help create more of a resilient area in those particular aspects as well. Here's some examples of what those look like and so forth. And a lot of this comes from what's happening here. Comes from, I don't know if I pronounce his name right because I'm not French, but Jean Piaget's theories of cognitive development really focused on child psychology, but so appropriate to be applied here as well. And Piaget said that adaptation is adjustment to the world. And so that's one thing that we're going to focus on is after a disaster is adjusting to that new world that it's given us. Piaget called a schema a cohesive, repeatable action sequence possessing, what does it even say? What's the word? Possessing the component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. That's basically our understanding of the world and how everything is connected and the system. And then he talks about assimilation. And so what a lot of people will do is their cognitive process takes new information and it fits it into their existing schema or their existing paradigm. And it just helps them, when they get the new information, it says, hey, that makes sense to me. And so they just fit it in and they go about their day because they've assimilated that information. It's not new information. It's not crazy information. They just assimilate it. But then we move into accommodation, and that's when the cognitive process really disrupts our understanding or disrupts the paradigm that we believe, the schema that we believe. And now all of a sudden we have to change that paradigm. We have to change that schema to fit the world because the new information just doesn't fit. It doesn't assimilate into the previous. So we have to accommodate. And then while we're wrestling with that, we have an equilibration. We're always looking to be even or be balanced. And so when we're doing that, we have to adjust, or that's where it goes back to we have to adapt to the changing environment. That will give us the equilibration that we're seeking as a human. And then if we're not, then we're in a state of disequilibrium. And that state of cognitive imbalance really has us with that feeling of things aren't right, things are off a little bit, and we're going to really be seeking that equalization. So here's some graphics about that process that you go through to deal with and what ultimately results in the adaptation of those schemas that we've come to understand or believe based on our training, based on our upbringing and our experiences and our religion and our everything that goes into us being human. But we have to adapt that when we get this new information that doesn't seem to fit right. Another interesting thing about adaptation is it's not just one way. And what I mean by that is it compounds. And so we see this with plants have grown, and scientists have acknowledged that some flowers have grown longer stems or floral tubes that allow for more of the process of the bee getting the nectar for the honey and pollinating those flowers and so forth. But what also has happened is when those longer floral tubes happen, bees started to come out with longer tongues. They adapted to this floral change. So now that they can maximize with longer tongues with these longer floral tubes. So that's what we also want to do in emergency management. We want to adapt on both sides of whatever the incident or the emergency is. Or in the case of this Venn diagram, you have emergency management, you have the individual, you have the community, all those three things that I talked about in the beginning. But in that middle section where they all overlap, that's where we want that co-evolution to adaptation to help us out. So it starts compounding our change and makes change a little bit more rapid. And we see this here. So we have that mutation that we talked about moving into adaptation, which then generates the transformation that you're looking for. And then once it gets not set in stone, because nothing's set in stone in our lives, that's kind of the point, but that does lead to evolution. When we're not going back, we're going forward. That's evolution. And then we go to co-evolution. So now we have ourselves changing, our community changing, and our emergency management program changing, all based on the adaptation process. And what that gives us is all kinds of feedback loops that we don't necessarily get with recovery. So recovery just focuses on what did we do bad in the response and what can we do going forward. But adaptation allows us to look at how can we change mitigation? How can we change what we're doing in preparedness? How can we change in response? And then what it also does is adaptation allows us to flash forward. Adaptation starts saying, okay, what are the new emerging threats that we're going to have to be prepared for next time? We can't just go back to the old one or the one that has happened. We know that they're going to get worse or they could be worse. And so we got to prepare for that. So that affects our mitigation, that affects our preparedness, and that affects our response mechanisms as well. So what it all looks as we mutate emergency management, we try a few different things and we decide, hey, A and C aren't really any good. We're not going to try that, but B worked really good. And there were some things about D that we like. So we're going to take some parts of D and we're going to also take E. We really like that. And that seemed to have a lot of promise in what we were doing. And then we put it into our little emergency management adaptation petri dish and mix it all together. And then we apply our emergency management principles and vision, mission, and the principles of emergency management. And then that should leave us with a better program of emergency management moving forward. So as we're coming near to the end, I would just focus on sharing with you that EM should replace recovery with adaptation. And each cycle of mutation should expect a trial, a variation, and some failure. And that's one thing that I think emergency managers are very worried about. We are risk averse and we do not want to make mistakes, and understandably, but there's got to be some things that we have to understand. Number one, we're not doing things perfectly. So failure isn't necessarily complete failure. If we're trying something differently to improve, it's our R&D kind of thing. We obviously want to do things and mitigate our risks in whatever changes that we're making, but focusing on doing things in a new way and approaching things with a new perspective will help us adapt. And at the same time, our profession must adapt to the needs that the community is requiring as well. And then we must lead change to improve resilience and flourishment. That's why we're here at the Leadership Symposium. We are leaders. We are called as emergency managers to lead our communities through the disaster and beyond. And so we should be leading that change through that disaster and then focusing on that adaptation phase, which should make us more resilient and allow us to flourish, as well as prepare for what we need to do as emergency managers is prepare for resistance. I'm sure many of you are very well aware that people don't like change, especially our bureaucracies in government. They don't like change. And so when we lead for change, when we are advocates for change, we're going to get resistance. We're going to get people saying, no, we shouldn't be doing that. The common phrase, this is the way we've always done it. And that's very popular, right? Just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean that it's right and doesn't mean that it can't be better. And so you have to balance, if it's not broke, don't fix it, with also, yeah, but technology has changed and people have changed and the environment has changed. We can't just always take that, if it's not broke, don't fix it. We have to focus on still, can we improve? Biography, I'll send this PowerPoint to Dan and he can pass it out to all the registrants and so forth. But this is all the documentation I did in preparation for this presentation, as well as the written journal. And with that, I'm open to any questions. I don't know how much time we have, Dan, but I'm back to you.
We have plenty of time for questions. If there are questions, please either put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you to come off mute and ask the question. There was some good comments made in here. One of them being, to improve resilience, we have to define resilience. And I was talking before a lot of people jumped on, is that there are a lot of different descriptions of and understanding of what resilience really is. So what would you think of resilience? How would you define it?
I was just in a meeting. What's that?
Nothing. I thought I couldn't hear you.
I was in a meeting earlier today. We were talking about our sub-strategy for emergency crisis management, and in it is the word resilience. I had a different word in there before, and that was changed because some people couldn't really just understand the word that I used. But that being said, I hate the word resilience. I think it's a buzzword for our community and more. And like you said, it has no meaning to me. It's just like nobody can define it. So why are we using this word? Like it's the best word in the world to use for emergency management. So first and foremost, I agree with you. Either we need to define it and stick to a universal definition, or we need to get rid of it, as far as I'm concerned, because it doesn't really tell us, it doesn't really give us the direction that we need when it's a great concept. I don't have a problem with the concept of resilience, but until we can really come to agreement on the term, then I would focus on just changing it altogether. That being said, when I hear the term resilience, to answer your question, resilience, I'm really focused more on anti-fragility from Nicholas, his name, but from his book Anti-Fragility. But it's that plus an ability to rebound, plus, thank you. I knew Todd knows.
Yeah, he does know.
Yeah. I was the one who told him to read the book. Yeah, it's multiple concepts put together, and it's not just one, I think. And that's some of our problem, because it's being a little bit resistant, it's being a little bit bendy, it's being a little bit ability to just snap back quickly. And I just don't like it for emergency management. It's crept in the last 10, 15 years, and a better definition for it, or just move on to the next buzzword.
Yeah. So we do have some hands up, which is great. John, you want to come off mute?
Sure. My name is John Romano, Disaster Central, and here we go. So the question I had in all of this mix, in this discussion, is here in the States, we've got a pretty large contingency of people. Actually, if you were to define it, it would be 25% of the US population that are interested, are actually not only interested in having a seat in the process of planning, but are putting forth or advocating for legislation to have a seat or more a stake in the conversation. And these could be defined as people, I guess, the more vulnerable populations. Is that something that figures into your speak? And do you see that where you're at? Do you see people who have greater vulnerabilities wanting to see more responsiveness by their emergency managers or governments, et cetera, to change? And that being a change in of itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that's very alarming to me as an emergency manager is where it catches a government off guard. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be baby Jessica down a well. Expectation is that we can fix it. The government can fix it. And hopefully we can, but when the headline comes out of whatever the emergency or the craziness is, when it comes out, they want us to be able to fix it right then. They have this expectation that we can fix any problem that ever comes down the pipe, especially when it comes to emergencies and disasters. When in reality, you look at emergency management's budgets and where they are compared to other budgets, police, fire, EMS, whatever, parks department, whatever. I can tell you here, we spend more money in gardening than we do in emergency management. So it's crazy if you look at some of those things where we're putting our priorities when we're talking about emergency management, who's responsible for the lives, livelihood, and quality of life of the constituents of our communities. That is a huge risk profile. And I stole that from Dr. Carol Swiak. Hopefully she'll be happy about that. But what a large portfolio for emergency managers, but yet, we get such a small amount of any type of budget. Our offices are usually the smallest offices. We don't have a lot of the staffing support that we probably need. Let's face it, emergency management is a profession that I could have 20 times the amount of people that I have right now work 80 hours a week. Every one of them work 80 hours a week, 40 hours overtime a week. And after 5 years, we still wouldn't be prepared, the most prepared that we could be. We can always improve. And so there's just really not being able to think the public doesn't understand what emergency management is. I think we all agree on that one. And the public doesn't understand how underfunded and how little we have in emergency management, but yet what role we play in terms of that risk portfolio that we're talking about. And so when we're talking about some of those underserved or underprivileged populations, I think our focus shouldn't be to outs to things, give emergency preparedness kits to every family or whatever the case may be. We should be looking at our community as how do we adapt to make them less vulnerable, and how do we adapt to improving their ability to deal with the disaster before, during, and after. And changing that mindset, I think, is more important than just trying to find some sort of spending some money and targeted program of improvement that gives people some material, some education, or whatever. It needs to be a mindset change, not just a physical change of.
So you're saying more emphasis on the preparedness side of the equation, so to speak.
Emphasis on the personal mental preparedness side of it, becoming more adaptable.
Okay. Thank you.
Get the public, regardless of underserved or not, away from depending on emergency management and more focused on emergency management and adapting to the changes that happen.
All right, thank you. The next, sorry, I think your mic's going in and out, just the FYI. But the next question will come from Christine and then Todd, and then we will take a small break.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, team, for bringing this together. Because, yeah, it's been awesome. Randal, hey, I just want to temper your desire to kick out resilient. Only because, so after 30 years of being in the field of land use, community planning, asset management planning, and disaster risk reduction, it's the only term that we actually are all familiar with, but we're all using it differently, as you said. So I more would like us to encourage, as a community, to clarify it for people, because I don't think it's going anywhere. And literally, my PhD is to define resiliency within those three professions and the fact that we all have to be working together. So that's the point I'm making, because after 30 years and the dysfunction that I see out there, and I hear you, brother, about the allocation. So please don't throw out resilience. And perhaps I would love to interview you for my PhD, because that's a perspective that really needs to come to the fore, Randal. The other point I was going to make was, let's not discount the emergency kits, because I have to say, Randal, in terms of, like you were saying, it's a mindset. And what I found doing climate adaptation work with communities, especially after big calamities, was putting together the emergency kit. Because when we go into the communities, I do nothing but stress them out, because I bring the maps, the data, and I'm like, oh, dude, your hazard areas, yeah, they're only going to amplify. And of course, everybody, so what I do is I'm like, okay, I'm stressing people out. I need to give them some sense of agency. And I found, going through the process of putting together an emergency kit and having the community together to do that, including with the kids, I could then feed them the information, exactly what you're talking about, and how adaptation and resilience is a mindset, right? And it's a constant. I love the presentation, dude. Thanks so much.
To clarify, I'm not opposed to emergency kits. I have my emergency kit, and I do think that people need them, and I think that we should encourage and educate and everything else. So I'm not opposed to the emergency kits. I think I was just more advocating for doing something, maybe not necessarily throwing away what we had there, but adding to it with a mindset change. And I think you were spot on with your statement about that it gives them agency. Hey, I've got this kit. Now what can I do with that kit during disaster and everything else? I think that's spot on. And with regards to the word resilience, first of all, I'm no authority, so I'm not going to be the one that says it's out of there. But advocating for changing recovery to adaptation, and that's not going anywhere. Nobody's changing it too much that I've seen anyway. And I've done this presentation all over the world. But that being said, I'm down. I love your dissertation topic, and would happy to schedule a call with you or whatever you need, whenever you need it, and participate with you on that. So
thanks, Randal. And sorry to suggest that you were suggesting that we try. I was just saying that sometimes it's those subtle little things that can get people to drop the guard and go, oh, what are we doing? Oh, okay. And then we start doing that while we feed them information. I know it seems a bit manipulative, but no, please don't think that I was discounting anything. I just thought it came across beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you. I would be very interested in reading that when you're done with it. So thank you very much. So Todd, you are up next.
ask questions.
Yes, of course. I'm going to actually take the other side, Christine, on what you're saying. I've been doing a lot of research specifically on and written tons on resiliency and what it means. And you're right, the concept of resiliency in the field of emergency management and even in climate reduction is critical. But the problem with the word is so squishy today that it's been, even there was a beer commercial talking about how resilient beer was. And there's a makeup called resilience and things like this that really move what that word means. And so when Randy suggested I read Taleb, or Taleb, however you want to pronounce it, Nicholas, he used the concept of antifragility in the sense that it's a stronger word he was looking for, more than robust, more than resilient. And although I still use the term resilient because that's what community understands at this point, it's either one, we have to take it back and redefine what it is for the entire community and get rid of the squishiness of it, or follow what Taleb's idea was and start using the concept of antifragility, where the difference between resiliency and antifragility is very simple. Resiliency, using the ecological term, is bouncing back when your system's under stress. back to where it was before, right? So you take a look at it would take a look at ecology where you go, okay, this system was flooded or chemicals or whatever, but now it's back to being where it is before. But the idea of anti-fragile is it becomes stronger and better after those stresses are put onto it. And I know it's a fake word, if you will, anti-fragile. And as we always say, words were made up anyway, right? So somebody had to make up a word. So if we utilize the concept of anti-fragility in lieu of, or maybe superior to the idea of resiliency, because it's been squished out, it's been so watered down in the concept. I think that's where kind of Randy was going specifically with that. And I was coming back on to support that Randy's concept of that and what that means. And yeah, so not that I'm disagreeing with the idea of resiliency, Christine. What it is like, how do we make that word stronger again? Or do we use a different term such as anti-fragility to get the point across? And so I do appreciate the work that you're doing, and I'd love to read it as well. And Randy, thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, the question I was going to ask you, Randy, that's where I was going to go with this.
Good. Yeah.
Sorry, is as you're taking a look at some of the work you've been doing specifically on the leadership side of things, how do we make emergency management that anti-fragile or resilient, as we use Christine's word, resilient profession that we are able to get out of the shadow of our first response brothers and sisters?
Make emergency management more resilient, or at least I think what you even mean by that is elevate the status of emergency management to be a little bit stronger within the government, and this is a big one for us as well. So many programs get trashed after an administration change, and then they have to build back up again, kind of thing. It becomes very 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing as we go through elected officials and that sort of thing. And so that makes it a problem as well. And I think that Carol's got it spot on, Carol Swiak, that I mentioned before, with the professionalization and the licensure aspects of it. And when we become as important to that community as the city attorney kind of thing, then we'll have a lot better standing within the community and a lot better standing within policy within the community that we're serving. And so that would be, at least if I were developing a strategic plan on how to make emergency management more resilient, that would definitely be in there. And the other thing is, I'm just going to use this moment for a quick little plug for Frame. And that's what you and Dan and I and several others have started to come together on with the Foundation for the Research and Advancement of Emergency Management, Frame spelled wrong. And check us out on our website, and I'm sure Dan can give that out or whatever. But I think that movement, what we're trying to do with that is to elevate emergency management as well, using that research so that we have a lot of strength in our arguments for emergency management.
Yeah, I'll definitely share that information with everybody as well on the Frame aspects of stuff. That'll all be sent out in the after email as well, so that we'll have a good amount of information that you guys could go and do some more research on and stuff like that. I know we're running over on time a little bit, which was great. It was an absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you, Randy. Thank you for staying up late, because you're up late over there for us and taking the time to share this. I'll share your contact information as well for those who may want to further conversation or follow up. Christine wants to follow up on interviewing for her dissertation. So thank you for that. I hope you get to stick around for the rest of the event, but I don't blame you if you don't, because I'm sure you're tired. But thank you so much. I'll definitely catch up.
Yeah, I definitely have to take off. I was up at 4 a.m. teaching at USC, which was 6 p.m. yesterday, and then I'm flying early morning to Dubai. So I need to go back.
Safe travels. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.